Hello, thank you for joining us for another edition of the Single Malt Review. Today we're going to look at something just slightly more attainable than what we've been looking at henceforth. And this one's Dave's bottle, so I'll let him pick it up and take it away.
Thank you, Jim. What we have here is a wee beauty. For 10 years it matured away in a bourbon cask. Then for 2 further years it sat in a ruby port cask. And at the end of that 12 years it became Glenmorangie's Quinta Ruban. It is a drop from the Highlands. This ticks many of my whiskey boxes in that it's from the Highlands. Certainly it has a unique sweetness to it. It's also been matured in port casks for at least some of its lifetime, which adds all kind of flavours which I personally am enormously fond of. It's bottled, as is often the case, at 46%. And looking at it, you have a lovely coppery reddish colour, quite unlike, say, any other whiskey that's not got that port influence.
No, it's a scrumptious little number, this one. Port maturation, that's picking up. It's still quite unusual to see something 100% port matured. You'll occasionally get a which one is it?
Oh, there was a Killerman we tried a few
There
episodes
was a
ago.
Killerman that was 100% port matured. There's one that should be extremely obvious to me, which will come back to me later in the episode, which occasionally will do 100% port cask matured, but it's a popular finish, and I think, though I'm not really one for finishes necessarily, I prefer to see my whiskies aged throughout in whatever cask they're going to be aged in. I can appreciate the finishes for what they are, and I think port cask is one of the better. I'm not absolutely on board with these some of the wine finishes, but I think port gives something very generous to a whiskey, and this is absolutely the case in this one. And it starts with the colour. That is absolutely rich, absolutely the colour of promise there.
While tawny port adds a more robust flavour and a much darker colour, its ruby port gives you this bright, clear, reddish pink colour. The polished copper analogy from before, that stands true. The flavour is not always as bold or as dark or as deep, but it's much more in keeping with.
And a little, just a touch of water, as usual for a slightly younger, slightly stronger whiskey. It opens it right up. I get a extremely ripe fruits, dark fruits off this one. Sort of cherries, nectarine, dark-skinned fruits like that, and all encrusted with a really quite a rich sort of a sugary crust on top of everything that I'm.
At the same time, when you get dark fruits, I get citrus, tangerines, mandarins, candied orange peel, that kind of thing.
And though it's sweet, there's a fresh crispness on the nose, which keeps it fresh and keeps me coming back for more. It's not a sickly aroma at all. It's a clean, crisp freshness, and it's really quite good. So let's see what's on the palate necessarily.
Yes, it's very juicy and sweet. Those port flavours are really punching through. I think having been aged in bourbon barrels before that, the bourbon imparts a nice, fairly mellow vanilla flavour, and then the port really builds on top of it. It layers up on top of the existing flavours and really gives it lots of its own character.
I'm getting a lot of spice, sweet spice. There's cinnamon, clove, nutmeg,
Ginger, black pepper.
some honey, and just on the end there's quite a dark woodiness coming through
It's
from
a real Christmas pudding of a whiskey.
probably the port cask, and it's really quite long in the finish. Now, as I said, I'm not the greatest fan of finishes, but was I to have to suffer a finish, then port cask would be up there as one of the favourites. I think Sauternes does a very good finish. I think really the biggest problem I have is with whiskies that are finished simply in sherry wood, whereas as opposed to matured in sherry wood. I think that just comes off as slightly comes off as a bit of a veneer, I think. But Portwood, Sauterne, these extremely characterful casks, I think 2 years is long enough for those to impart their particular character onto a whiskey.
I, on the other hand, am a hopeless sucker for whiskey that has been exposed to port at some point in its life, whether it's matured or finished. Ruby port, or especially tawny port, imparts so many characters, so many flavours to the whiskey, which you won't get from either whiskey by itself or port by itself. So the two together, it's really special to me. In fact, my favourite whiskey of all time, the greatest whiskey ever, which is Glenmorangie 20-year-old tawny port finish, is, well, as I say, my favourite whiskey of all time.
And there, you've brought it back to me, Glenmorangie. That was the distillery I was thinking of. Very occasionally, when they do their almost biannual, these days, run of single casks, which are very good and very expensive, and I may have one to show off at some point, we'll have to see. They do occasionally do a 100% port matured, which can be extremely interesting if you can find them.
Glenmorangie, like Glenmorangie, being a Highland whiskey, whiskies from the Highlands, in my experience, are usually very light and sweet, with relatively little, sometimes no peat whatsoever, which really works for me. I like the sweetness, I like the cloying accessibility, the inviting moorishness. I'm a true fan of a Highland whiskey.
No, this one, for a finish, I think it's carefully made. It's thoughtfully put together. It's not just slapped on there to give a whiskey a slightly more appealing name, or to say it's sherried or whatever. I think it's done quite deliberately and quite skillfully.
And while I've tried a few Glenmorangies in my time, this is the first one I have owned. It really stood out to me so much the first time I tried it. I just had to own one. I had no real choice in the matter. It is that good. It is a superb dram. And
I believe it's quite a reasonable buy.
It is.
And should be broadly available, even in liquor stores, I think. I've seen it about town. And if you can see it down here, then you can surely see it internationally. So keep your eyes open and you'll probably spot it. But without going too in depth, I think it's an extremely good whiskey. If I wasn't such a hard marker for finishes, I would probably give it more. But I'm going to give this one a 7 from me.
I'm going to go higher. I'd rate this an 8. I'll go higher than 8, but I must round back to a whole number for practicality's sake. If you enjoy sweetness, you enjoy port, you enjoy whiskey, you enjoy spices, this is a whiskey for you. It's certainly a whiskey for me.
So there we are. Do look out for it if you can find it. It should be, broadly speaking, available, but a very good whiskey and really quite a good score. So there you have it, really. But thank you for joining us, and we will be back very shortly with another single malt review. So stick around. Sludge it.